I don't talk about this night often. Even now, years later, I feel the hairs on the back of my neck rise when I think about it. But maybe putting it into words will finally get it out of my system. Back in 2014, I was a college sophomore renting a small one-bedroom apartment off campus. It wasn't anything special. Cheap carpet, squeaky pipes, paper-thin walls. But it was my first place away from home, and I loved the freedom. The only problem was the ground floor window. It faced a narrow alley between my building and the one next door. Hardly any sunlight ever reached in, and at night it felt like a black void pressed against the glass. The first time I noticed something strange was late one Thursday. I was cramming for a midterm, sitting at my desk by that very window. I had my headphones on, listening to lo-fi beats, when a feeling of unease washed over me. It wasn't sound, more like a shift in the air. I pulled my headphones off and froze. From the corner of my eye, I thought I saw movement outside. The blinds were drawn, but small gaps let in strips of light from the street lamp in the distance. And in one of those strips, I swore I saw the shape of a face. I stood, heart hammering, and yanked the blinds open. Nothing. Just the alley. Dumpsters, cracked pavement, a cat darting into the shadows. I laughed it off, telling myself it was stress. But the next night, it happened again. I was brushing my teeth when I heard a faint tapping. 3 slow, deliberate taps. I stepped into the living room, and my stomach sank. The sound was coming from the window. I crept closer. The blinds were closed, but the tapping continued. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 more. Not random. Someone wanted me to know they were there. I grabbed the nearest thing I could use as a weapon, a heavy desk lamp, and yanked the blinds open. Again, nothing. Just the alley. The tapping stopped. My hands shook so badly I could barely set the lamp down. Over the next week, it escalated. Every night, around 2 a.m., I would wake up to noises, footsteps crunching gravel, low whispers, the faint scrape of nails on glass. Once, I swear I heard my name, breathed in a hushed voice. Daniel. I stopped sleeping near the window. I dragged my mattress into the living room, far from that alley. But even there, I felt watched. I'd catch shadows shifting across the walls, though no cars passed outside. Sometimes the power would flicker for no reason, plunging me into silence and darkness. I told my friends, but they laughed it off. You're just paranoid, man. Too much caffeine and horror podcasts. So I kept it to myself. Then came the night that cemented my fear. It was raining hard, wind rattling the loose panes in my window. I'd fallen asleep on the couch, comforted by the sound of the storm. At 3 a.m., I jolted awake. Not from thunder, but from silence. The rain had stopped. The air felt heavy, still. I turned my head toward the window across the room and froze. Through the gap in the blinds, a face stared in at me. Pale, expressionless, eyes too wide, reflecting faint light like an animal's. The glass fogged with each breath it took. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. My chest seized as pure terror rooted me to the couch. Then, slowly, the face tilted sideways, like it was studying me. A thin smile spread across its lips. I don't remember grabbing my phone. I just remember my trembling fingers dialing 911. My voice cracked as I whispered to the operator that someone was at my window. She told me to stay on the line, that police were on their way. When I finally dared to look back, the face was gone. Minutes later, flashing red and blue lights filled the alley. 2 officers searched the area but found nothing. No footprints, no signs of forced entry. One of them gave me a sympathetic look and said, "Storms can play tricks on your eyes." But I knew what I'd seen. The fog on the glass proved it hadn't been a trick. Someone had been breathing there, watching me sleep. I moved out the next week, packed everything into my car, and crashed on a friend's couch until I found a new place. I never set foot in that apartment again. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't woken up that night. Would they have tried the window latch, climbed inside while I slept? I'll never know. But even now, when I walk past dark alleys or catch my reflection in glass at night, I feel it, the certainty that someone is still watching.
Public transportation is supposed to be boring, anonymous, uneventful. You get on, zone out, get off. But what happened to me in the fall of 2017 still makes me avoid buses to this day. At the time, I was working late shifts at a diner on the outskirts of town. The only way home was the 1:15 a.m. bus, nearly empty, always quiet, just a couple of exhausted workers and the occasional drunk. It was routine, and I didn't think twice about it. One night, I boarded as usual. The bus was nearly empty, just the driver, a woman scrolling her phone in the front row, and a man sitting at the very back. I didn't pay him much attention. I chose my usual seat, halfway down by the window. The ride began normally, the hum of the engine, the flicker of fluorescent lights overhead. But after a few minutes, I felt it, that prickling sensation between my shoulder blades, like eyes boring into me. I glanced back. The man in the last row was staring straight at me. He wasn't blinking. His head was slightly tilted, his eyes wide, unblinking, locked onto mine. Even when I turned back around, I could feel it, his gaze like a physical weight pressing against the back of my neck. I told myself not to panic. Maybe he was drunk, maybe he wasn't even looking at me, just zoned out. But curiosity gnawed at me. A few stops later, I glanced back again. He hadn't moved. Same position, same stare, only now his lips were moving, slowly, silently, like he was mouthing words I couldn't hear. My pulse quickened. I shifted in my seat, leaning closer to the window, pretending to look outside. The streets blurred past, empty, dark, lifeless. But no matter how much I tried to ignore him, the sense of being watched grew unbearable. By the time half the passengers had gotten off, it was just me, the driver, and him. Then something changed. I realized he was no longer at the back of the bus. He had moved quietly, without me noticing. He now sat 2 rows behind me, still staring. I froze. My mouth dried. How had he moved without a sound? I hadn't heard footsteps, hadn't felt the shift in weight, but there he was, closer, still mouthing those silent words. I considered getting up, asking the driver for help, but the aisle between me and her felt impossibly long, and something in me whispered not to turn my back on him. The next stop approached, my stop. The bus hissed to a halt, doors opening. Relief washed over me. I could get off, run the block to my apartment, lock the door behind me. I stood, gripping the metal pole, and hurried toward the exit. But just before stepping off, I glanced back one last time. He was still seated, still staring, still mouthing those words. I nearly tripped on the curb as I bolted down the street. The bus pulled away, disappearing into the night. I thought that was the end of it. But when I reached my apartment building, fumbling with the keys, I felt it again, that prickling sensation. I turned. At the corner, under the flickering streetlight, stood the same man. He hadn't gotten off at my stop. He hadn't been behind me on the sidewalk, but somehow, impossibly, he was there, watching me, his face pale, his lips still moving, words I still can't hear.
I've always loved hiking. The quiet, the fresh air, the sense of being away from everything. But one trip into the woods ruined that peace forever. This was in 2019, late summer. I'd gone to a state forest about an hour from my town. It wasn't a popular trail, just a few miles winding through dense trees, no cell service, no crowds. Perfect for clearing my head. The first few miles were uneventful. Birds chirping, leaves crunching beneath my boots, sunlight streaming through the canopy. But around mile 3, I noticed something odd. A camera. It was mounted high on a tree, pointed directly at the trail. Not a Park Service camera. This was different. Black, boxy, with a faint red light blinking. I frowned. Probably a hunter's trail cam, I told myself. But the angle was strange. It wasn't aimed at animals. It was aimed at people walking by. I kept going, shaking off the unease. But a half-mile later, I spotted another and another. Cameras mounted every few trees, always facing the path, always blinking. By the time I reached the clearing, I'd counted at least a dozen. That's when I saw him. A man, maybe mid-40s, standing at the edge of the clearing. He wore a faded jacket, his hands stuffed into his pockets. He wasn't hiking, no backpack, no water bottle. He just stood there, perfectly still, watching me. I froze. My instinct screamed to turn around, but my legs felt like stone. We stared at each other for what felt like minutes. Then, without a word, he raised one hand and pointed at the trail behind me. I spun around. Nothing. Just trees, silent and unmoving. When I looked back, he was gone. Panic surged through me. I turned and hurried back down the trail, heart pounding, scanning every shadow. The cameras seemed closer now, blinking faster. At one point, I swore I heard a faint, mechanical whir like they were following me. By the time I reached my car, I was drenched in sweat. I slammed the doors, locked them, and sped out of the lot without looking back. But it didn't end there. That night, I woke to a sound outside my apartment window. A faint click. When I peeked through the blinds, my stomach dropped. A camera was mounted on the streetlight across from my building. A small red light blinked in the dark. The next morning, it was gone. I never hiked that trail again. I moved apartments within a month, but the paranoia never left me. Even now, I cover my laptop camera, tape over my phone lens, and avoid any place that feels too quiet. Because sometimes, when the house is still, I hear it again, that faint, mechanical click. Watching, recording. And I know deep down that whoever was behind those cameras hasn't stopped watching me.